5 members of the Toronto Maple Leafs on the board. Number 10, Oliver Ekman-Larsson atop them. Bobby McMahon, Scott Laughton, Simon Benoit, Kylie Yarncroke also on this list. You mentioned the fact that the vibes in Ottawa, a little bit better. The vibes, not so great in Toronto, considering where they're at in the standings. What do you think of the week ahead for Brad Treliving and the Toronto Maple Leafs?
I mean, it's a tough week if you're in Brad Treliving's seat because, you know, at the end of the day, as much as we and the market are going to focus on, you know, the Leafs as sellers and them having to sell, you don't want to just sell the players for nothing, right? At the end, like you have to, when all is said and done, feel good about the return you're getting in order to make this make sense. Now, some of the pending UFAs, if they don't end up signing Bobby McMahon, and as of this weekend, they were still trying, so that's no guarantees they won't. But if they don't get him signed to an extension, you know, I think you have to move someone like that, a Scott Laughton in a similar spot, just because you're trying to at least get something back for them. But, you know, the Oliver Ekman-Larssons or other players that do have some term left, you know, you got to be careful there. And, you know, I think Ekman-Larsson, all things being equal, would like to stay. He's got a half no trade protection as well. But, you know, he also is having a tremendous season and you know, it sounds like could bring them back a first round pick and maybe something beyond that. So, you know, I think it's a difficult week to navigate if you're Treliving, especially because the market isn't heated up just yet, right? I mean, you know, teams do need two to tango, so to speak. And, you know, if it ends up being a bit of a buyer's market and there's more players available than are, you know, attractive assets out there, you know, this could be a long week in Toronto where maybe the selling does, you know, you almost feel like when the team has performed as it has, I think that almost ups the expectation in the fan base that okay, they're really going to pivot hard into selling. And I think people want to see the start of a new shift in direction. It'll be fascinating to see if they aren't able to drum up the interest they need to make that make sense. You know, either way, don't get me wrong. I think we're going to be talking about the Leafs making trades, but whether we're talking about 3 players out the door or 4 or 5 or 6, you know, that's going to be very market dependent. And, you know, Treliving's got to get this right. I mean, there's no other way to put it. The last year's trade deadline, with the benefit of hindsight, the Leafs didn't get it right. I think, you know, the one thing I'll say, because history will revise itself, I think that the Leafs had every reason to go in as they did at last year's deadline. You know, they ended up finishing atop the Atlantic Division. Obviously, they beat the Ottawa Senators in the first round. They got to a Game 7 with Florida. We know how it went, but they were pretty close to being a team that could go on a run. And I think they had a reason to believe they could go on a run. So, you know, it just turns out with hindsight, they might not have, or I can say they didn't get the right players maybe for the level of assets they gave up. They were chasing it a little bit. You know, but this is an important deadline. You're not going to undo all that in one trade deadline. Don't get me wrong. You know, when you trade Scott Laughton at this deadline, you're not getting back what you paid for him, but that, you know, at this point, that's a sunk cost. And so I do think it's important for the Leafs to come out of this with the cupboards a little better stocked, with maybe some positions on the roster for younger guys. You know, I personally think there's an argument for, you know, basically setting the conditions where you fall down the standings. Mm-hmm. I know I'm saying that in a market where they don't own their first round pick if it falls at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if it's after the top 5. But I think, look at the defensive results. Look how the year's gone. The fact you're going to, you know, we know they have injuries on this roster. I mean, that has played some role in this, but maybe you shut a couple players down and you know, get them healing. And so they're in a position to help you more next year. You know, I think that there's an argument for it, although the math is not particularly in the Leafs' favor then. And if you bring that into play, you bring in the possibility you're giving the Bruins a really high pick. But to me, I would want better lottery odds because they could potentially win first or second pick, you know, with better odds. And you know, look what that did for the Islanders this year. You know, they won the lottery last year. They weren't the last place team in the league. And Matthew Schaefer just scored his 20th goal on Sunday night. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe an 18-year-old defenseman has been that good, but he's changed their whole franchise. I'm not going to put those hopes on any of the top picks of this year's draft, but if the Leafs somehow got one of them, and while also having, you know, a Matthews and a Nylander and some of the players that are already there, I think it vastly changes the outlook. And so, you know, I would be making that the argument for them to try to help things fall back. I don't believe that that's what Tree Living and Company will do, though. You know, but look at they're caught in the middle, man. I think they're almost the same number of points from the fifth bottom spot as they are from a playoff spot, and they're not likely to land in either zone.
Yeah, that's the worst place you could be. You feel free to size up the market for each of these players, but one guy I'm particularly interested in is Scott Laughton. We talk about the fact that at the top of your board, and I get it, there are other players you can look at, but the center position is very much prominent. I wonder how that could stack up as a domino effect for a player like Scott Laughton, who is much more affordable cap-wise compared to a Vinny Trocheck or a Nazem Kadri.
Yeah, well, it definitely helps. And, you know, he's already been carved down to a $1.5 million cap hit, you know, in the first move with Philadelphia. The Leafs can obviously chop that to $750 if they're so inclined. They have a retention spot to do it. And, you know, when you're adding a player like that, you know, who ticks a lot of boxes, high character guy, you know, good work rate, sticks up for his teammates, can win you a face off. You know, you know, I think they should definitely be able to turn him into something of interest in terms of the draft pick coming back their way. And so, you know, there was a reason the Leafs gave up a first rounder for him. You know, might have been a stretch, but they were getting him at 50% retention, and he wasn't on an expiring deal, which appealed to them at the time. You know, very much think that contenders will like the idea of a Scott Laughton, as cheap as he might be, just given some of the playoff considerations and the new cap rules that everyone has to consider.
Anything else you want to mention about Toronto before I touch on the rest of the Canadian picture ahead of the deadline?
I'm setting the number of players at the door at 3.5.
Okay. All right. Are
you going over or are you going under?
I'm going over. I'm taking the over.
Darn, I was going to do that too. I like being I like when we're on different sides of kind of the bet. But
do you want me to go under for the? I can go under for the sake of this debate.
No. We'll both go over.
Okay.
But that, you know what? The fact that we're both inclined to go over, it actually illustrates what I'm talking about, where the expectations are, and it's got to be a bit of a nervy position because you can't just be trading your guys for nothing. Like, if you're trading players out, it has to make sense, and certainly nothing has made sense yet for the Leafs, and you know, clock's ticking now towards the deadline.